Hello everyone, and welcome back. Imagine the night pressing close around you. No streetlights, no hum of electricity, only the scrape of wind through trees and the faint bleat of a restless goat. The air smells of wood smoke and damp earth. It is late October in a medieval village, and darkness falls heavier here than anything you have ever known. You can't tell if that flicker ahead is a candle in a window or a spirit lantern. Somewhere down the lane, laughter and chanting drift toward you, uneasy sounds that seem both human and not. That is Halloween, centuries before candy bars and neon skeletons. Back then, it was not called Halloween at all. It was a night on the edge of winter, a time when the living whispered to the dead and everyone prayed they were heard kindly. The villagers gathered not to play dress-up but to guard themselves from what might slip through the veil between worlds. Tonight, we are not in suburbia. We are in a muddy hamlet surrounded by fields already bare from harvest. The moon sits low, veiled by clouds. Dogs bark at nothing. And if you could step inside that world for just one night, you might realize that the modern glow of jack-o'-lanterns carries echoes of fires much older and far more serious. Today, Halloween is bright, noisy, sweetened, and safe, a holiday for fun, not fear. But in medieval times, it was none of those things. It was a boundary, a hinge between the bright half of the year and the dark. People did not decorate for charm. They lit fires to keep the unknown out. Their costumes were not polyester, they were armor made of superstition. The night was not about entertainment. It was about survival of spirit and community. This is where our story begins, a world ruled by faith, hunger, and rumor. Every sound after sunset could be a thief, a ghost, or both. Every light might be salvation or a lure. And yet, amid that fear, villagers found ways to laugh, feast, and sing. Their version of Halloween was not only about death, it was about defiance. To understand it, you have to imagine life as they lived it. The average villager had survived another harvest but was not sure about the next one. The success of crops meant survival through winter. A bad yield could mean hunger or worse. So when the last of the grain was stored and the fields turned to frost, a kind of collective exhale filled the air. The hard work was done. The uncertainty began. And just as the natural world dimmed, so did the human one. Candles replaced daylight, cold crept in, illness returned. And with all that darkness, stories bloomed, stories of souls returning, of ancestors visiting, of fairies and demons testing the living. These were not told to scare children for fun. They were told because they felt true. On this night, the final night before the long winter, they gathered. They built fires high enough to kiss the stars. They sang old songs, some sacred, some strange. They believed the dead could walk among them, and so they made space, a chair at the table, a crust of bread on the hearth. To them, this was not morbid. It was respect. Connection. It is tempting to view these villagers as superstitious or naive, but in truth, they lived in a reality that demanded humility. The unseen ruled their world: weather, plague, fate. Science had not yet named the patterns that shaped their lives. So when storms destroyed crops or a cow fell ill, it was easier to believe in spirits than in chance. The church, rising in authority, recognized that power. It could not erase the old beliefs completely, so it baptized them instead. The pagan festival of Samhain, pronounced Samhain, became All Hallows Eve, the vigil before All Saints' Day. And suddenly, the night that once belonged to wandering spirits belonged also to prayers for souls in purgatory. The line between sacred and pagan blurred so deeply that few even noticed. That blend gave the medieval Halloween its flavor. Holy yet mischievous, fearful yet celebratory. People prayed for the dead but also mocked death with masks and laughter. They lit candles for saints and bonfires for spirits. It was not contradiction. It was balance. Step closer to that bonfire for a moment. You would feel the heat bite against cold skin, sparks flying into the smoke-filled night. The sound of singing would come and go with the wind. Someone plays a rough pipe. Dogs circle the edge, whining. The faces around the flames are marked with soot and laughter lines. Children dart between adults, waving carved turnips instead of pumpkins. Their tiny lanterns glow with tallow candles, the light trembling with every gust. The smell of roasted parsnip and ale thickens the air. It is not a party, it is survival dressed as ritual. Every element meant something. The fire purified. The food honored the dead. The masks protected. The songs remembered. Together, they built a fragile bubble of warmth in a cold and uncertain world. But under that warmth lived unease. Villagers believed that on this night, the boundary between worlds was thin. The dead could visit, yes, but so could other things. Mischievous spirits, wandering souls, the fair folk from the old hills. Some stories warned against looking out a window after midnight. Others said to carry iron in your pocket or to never walk home alone. Imagine walking back from the bonfire to your cottage. The road is narrow, the trees claw the sky. Your turnip lantern keeps flickering out. Behind you, something moves in the dark. Maybe it is a neighbor. Maybe it is not. You walk faster. By the time you reach your door, you are shaking but you hang the lantern anyway. It is what your mother did. It is what her mother did. Tradition is comfort. And that is what made medieval Halloween powerful, not fear, but togetherness. Every family in the village took part in some way, baking, singing, tending fires. The line between the living and the dead might blur, but so did the one between rich and poor. For one night, everyone gathered around the same flame. It was not just symbolic warmth. It was practical survival. Fire kept away wolves and worse. Song kept spirits, human or otherwise, at bay. Sharing food reminded people they were not alone. In a world where famine and illness could strike any winter, that kind of unity mattered as much as faith. The laughter, the noise, the flicker of light, those were not indulgence. They were resistance. A way to say, we are still here. Fast forward centuries later. Electric lights hum, costumes glow in synthetic fabric, candy pours from factory molds. But beneath all of it, the old rhythm beats on. We still gather, still disguise, still light the dark. We may not believe in spirits, but we act like we do, turning off the lights, carving faces into fruit, daring the night to look back. Modern Halloween feels safe because we built fences of reason around it. Yet, in truth, it still plays the same role. It lets us flirt with fear, remember mortality, and then laugh it away. The medieval villager and the modern trick-or-treater are not so different. Both step into the dark for one night, protected by light and company, curious about what might be watching. So tonight, as we explore what Halloween meant in the Middle Ages, keep that image close: the fire, the masks, the thin line between fear and celebration. Forget the candy. Forget the movies. Picture a world where darkness was real, where people carved lanterns from turnips because they believed the dead might actually come home. We will wander through that world together. Through its fires and feasts, its prayers and pranks. You will see how a night that began in dread turned into one of the most enduring celebrations in history. But before we go deeper, take a breath. Listen to the quiet between breaths. That is the sound medieval villagers feared most, the pause between the last note of the song and whatever might answer back. That is where Halloween was born. Before the church's bells began to toll for All Saints' Day, before anyone called it Halloween, there was Samhain. To the people of ancient and early medieval Europe, especially across Ireland, Scotland, and parts of Wales, Samhain marked the turning of the year, the moment when summer's light died and the dark half began. It was not a single evening of costumes and treats. It was a season of endings and beginnings, wrapped in ritual, fear, and awe. The agricultural calendar shaped everything. For a farmer in the 9th century, life was dictated by the sun, the soil, and the stubborn will of the weather. Samhain came just after the final harvest, when the last sheaves of grain were cut and stored, when livestock were driven from high pastures into pens, and when any animals unlikely to survive the winter were slaughtered. Food meant survival, and Samhain meant reckoning. The stores were counted, debts settled, and the village braced for the long cold. But there was more than practicality in those preparations. Samhain carried an almost electric sense of transition. The Celts divided the year into two halves, light and dark, and Samhain was the boundary stone between them. Boundaries, in their worldview, were powerful things. They were thresholds where rules bent and other forces slipped through. Day met night, harvest met frost, the living world brushed the realm of the dead. People lit great bonfires on hilltops to guide the living and ward off the wandering spirits. In many places, every household extinguished its hearth before nightfall. Only when the communal fire burned bright would they carry the new flame home to relight their own. It was a symbolic act, renewal through shared light, but it also kept the village bound together. The smoke rising from that central blaze carried prayers, hopes, and fears into the dark sky. Samhain was a spiritual checkpoint. The living honored their ancestors, not as distant ghosts but as active presences. Families left food outside their doors or by the hearth, offerings for visiting souls. They set extra places at the table, believing that the dead might come home, unseen but near. The veil was thin, they said, and on this night even the smallest candle might draw a lost spirit back to warmth. Not all visitors were welcome. Folklore warned of tricksters, the Aussie, or fair folk who wandered freely during Samhain. These were not the gentle fairies of later stories. They were powerful, unpredictable beings connected to ancient barrows and mounds. Some could bless a field. Others could blight it. So people disguised themselves in rough costumes of fur, bone, and soot, hoping to confuse or appease whatever crossed their path. If the spirits thought you were one of them, perhaps they would pass you by. In that sense, costuming was not entertainment, it was survival wrapped in ritual. The masks, the cloaks, the noise, they all served a purpose. Villagers would parade between homes, chanting or drumming, driving out bad luck before winter. Some carried hollowed turnips with candles inside to mimic ghostly faces. The flame inside was not only to light the way, it was a beacon, a defense, and perhaps an invitation to friendlier spirits. The festival also carried a quieter side. Divination rituals filled the hours after the bonfire died down. Apples and nuts, fruits of the last harvest, were tools for glimpsing what lay ahead. Drop an apple peel over your shoulder, and the shape it formed on the floor might spell the first letter of your future love's name. Place 2 hazelnuts near the fire, naming them for lovers. If they burned together, the pair was destined to last, but if they popped apart, so would the bond. It was both game and guidance, a way to claim a bit of control over an uncertain future. In the countryside, people also told stories, long tales of warriors and ghosts, heroes and lost loves. Around flickering fires, the bards and elders carried memory for the community. Samhain nights were thick with storytelling, the kind that blurred fact and legend. A haunting was not just superstition. It was a way to explain the strange weight of the season, the chill that seemed to breathe against your neck when you stepped outside alone. To modern ears, much of this sounds mystical, even romantic, but to the medieval mind it was simply part of living. The dead were not gone. They were neighbors in another realm. Samhain was a handshake across that boundary. It offered reassurance that the world was still, connected, that the cycles of light and dark, birth and decay, would continue. When Christianity spread through Celtic lands, it faced a problem Samhain was too deeply rooted to erase. Missionaries saw that these fire-lit gatherings and offerings for the dead carried moral weight for the people, so instead of forbidding them outright, the Church reframed them. In the 8th century, Pope Gregory III established All Saints' Day on November 1st, a feast to honor every holy person who had entered heaven. The evening before naturally became All Hallows Eve. Over time, the new feast did not destroy Samhain. It absorbed it. Villagers now prayed for the souls of Christian dead alongside their older customs. The fires still burned, but priests blessed them. The offerings remained, but the prayers changed language. That blending marked the birth of medieval Halloween. The spiritual logic stayed intact. A night of thresholds, a time to honor the dead, and a moment of communal protection against whatever roamed the dark. Yet the symbols evolved. Turnips and coals gave way, centuries later, to pumpkins and candles. The chants turned to songs for soul cakes. Even the timing October 31st to November 2nd mirrored the original 3-day Samhain period. In those centuries, you could stand in a village square and feel the layering of belief. The church bells called for vespers. While beyond the walls, villagers kindled hilltop fires as their ancestors had. Both acts were prayers. Both spoke to the same hunger, to feel safe at the edge of the unknown. What is striking about Samhain is how practical and poetic it was at once. It acknowledged fear but refused to surrender to it. People faced death not by pretending it did not exist, but by inviting it to the table, feeding it, and sending it back satisfied. There was humility in that, and acceptance that life and death were part of the same rhythm. Imagine again the night wind sweeping across harvested fields, carrying the scent of peat smoke. Families cluster inside timber houses, the fire low, the door barred but the hearth offering a faint, steady glow. Outside, somewhere beyond the trees, the embers of the communal bonfire still burn. The darkness feels almost alive. A mother whispers a prayer for her ancestors. A child holds a carved turnip and watches the candlelight dance. In that small circle of warmth, belief is not abstract. It is survival, culture, comfort all woven together. This is the foundation on which medieval Halloween would stand. When villagers of later centuries gathered to light bonfires, wear masks, and give out soul cakes, they were echoing gestures far older than their churches. Older even than their languages. Samhain's bones were still there beneath the Christian robes. The medieval celebration simply dressed them anew. So when we speak of Halloween's origins, it is not just a history of pumpkins and ghosts. It is the story of how people, living on the knife edge between harvest and hunger, used ritual to make sense of fear. Samhain taught them that endings are beginnings. That darkness can be honored, and that the living are never truly alone. And though centuries have passed, the instinct remains. We still gather as the year dies. We still light the dark. We still laugh in the face of uncertainty, carrying our little flames against the vast night just as they did at Samhain. When Christianity began spreading across the old Celtic and Anglo-Saxon lands, it did not sweep in like a hammer destroying what came before. It crept in softly, step by step, wrapping itself around existing customs until the old and new became impossible to tell apart. The people of those early medieval villages did not suddenly stop believing in the old gods, nor did they easily give up the fires that had warmed their ancestors at Samhain. Instead, they carried their traditions into a new faith, reshaping them just enough to fit under a Christian sky. That process, part diplomacy, part survival, gave birth to the version of Halloween the medieval world would come to know, half sacred, half superstitious, a night where saints and spirits shared the same firelight. When the church looked north and west from Rome, it saw peoples deeply attached to their festivals, particularly those tied to the turning of the seasons. Banning them outright risked rebellion or quiet disobedience. Instead, missionaries learned to translate symbols rather than erase them. Fire became light from God. Feasts became offerings of thanksgiving. Prayers to ancestors became prayers for souls in purgatory. The pattern was simple: baptize what could be baptized, sanctify what could not, and let the people keep the rhythm that held their world together. By the 7th and 8th centuries, the Christian calendar began absorbing the pagan one. Pope Boniface IV had dedicated the Pantheon in Rome to the Virgin Mary and all martyrs in the year 609, establishing a feast for all saints. Later, Pope Gregory III moved that feast to November 1st. The logic was clear: if you can't stop people from celebrating Samhain, move your feast beside it, and soon the two will merge. The day after the pagan festival became All Saints' Day, and the night before October 31st became All Hallows Eve. Over time, that name softened, slurred, and settled into Halloween. To the villagers of medieval Europe, this shift was not a dramatic theological revelation. It was practical continuity. They still gathered by firelight. They still offered bread and prayers. Only now, the prayers carried new words and a new hierarchy. Where once they had left food for wandering ancestors, now they baked soul cakes to offer for departed Christian souls. Children and beggars moved from house to house, receiving these small cakes in exchange for promises of prayer. The poor gained food, the rich gained spiritual comfort, and the ritual found new meaning without losing its bones. The Church's attempt to tame Samhain created a hybrid faith, a tapestry woven from both heaven and earth. On one level, it reaffirmed Christian truths about resurrection and eternal life. On another, it quietly preserved the pagan sense of cyclical renewal, the turning of seasons, the thinness of the veil between worlds. In monasteries, monks prayed for the saints and martyrs. In villages, farmers still whispered to their dead by the hearth. The two acts might have looked different, but they were rooted in the same human need, to feel that life and death belonged to a single story. In that blending, symbolism mattered more than doctrine. Fire, once the heart of Samhain, remained central. Priests blessed bonfires instead of condemning them. The flame now stood not as a ward against spirits but as a sign of divine presence. People carried blessed embers home to reignite their hearths, linking their households to the sacred flame of the community. And when bells rang on the morning of November 1st, they echoed through smoky valleys where the fires still smoldered, marking not a clash of religions but a shared act of remembrance. The medieval imagination was skilled at holding contradictions. A peasant could fear ghosts yet pray to saints with the same breath. The dead were both dangerous and holy, restless and deserving of compassion. All Hallows Eve sat precisely at that intersection, the Church's insistence on salvation meeting the villagers' instinct to honor the unseen. And that duality gave the holiday its strange, magnetic power. In one village, the priest might lead a procession to the churchyard, chanting Latin hymns for the faithful departed. A few hours later, the same villagers' robes exchanged for rags or animal skins might roam the lanes singing for soul cakes. To modern eyes, it looks like contradiction. To them, it was completeness. The sacred and the playful, the serious and the absurd, belonged to the same night. The church did not entirely approve of the chaos. Of course. Ecclesiastical records from England and France occasionally scolded parishioners for turning holy vigils into revelry. But the clergy knew better than to crush custom entirely. They had seen what happened when faith demanded too sharp a break from the old ways. The people quietly returned to their fires in secret. Better to let the two coexist under watchful eyes than to risk rebellion of the soul. So medieval Halloween evolved as a negotiation. The church offered meaning. The people provided color. All Saints' Day gave structure. Samhain gave heart. The calendar became theology. You could touch flame, bread, and smoke instead of ink on parchment. Even the saints, in their way, became heirs to the pagan gods, protectors of places, patrons of trades, guardians of crops and animals. In the medieval village, St. Bridget's feast still carried the glow of the old Celtic goddess Bridget. Just as St. John's fire in midsummer echoed the ancient solstice bonfires. Religion changed its name, but not its voice. By the High Middle Ages, this fusion defined daily life. All Hallows Eve was followed by All Saints' Day and then All Souls' Day on November 2nd, creating a 3-day remembrance of the dead known as Hallowtide. It was a sacred extension of Samhain's cycle, now wrapped in Christian ritual. The faithful lit candles in windows and prayed for the souls of family members, believed to be in purgatory, trusting that their prayers might ease suffering in the afterlife. Villagers would also ring bells through the night, a haunting sound meant to comfort souls and keep demons at bay. Inside stone churches, the chants rose in Latin. Outside, the air filled with smoke and laughter. Children chased each other with lanterns made from hollowed roots. Musicians played crude instruments by the dying bonfires. Between verses of psalms, you might hear a story about the wandering dead, about saints who battled darkness, or about a farmer who met a spirit on the road. It was impossible to tell where theology ended and folklore began, and perhaps no one cared. That mingling produced something rare, a cultural truce. Paganism was not entirely gone, but it had been softened, turned inward, reinterpreted. Christianity, rather than shattering the old worldview, absorbed its symbols like roots drawing from ancient soil. The result was a faith that felt both eternal and local, cosmic yet intimate. Halloween, All Hallows Eve, was its living metaphor, the old world and the new world walking side by side through the dark. If you imagine the landscape of Europe at that time, forests thick and unbroken, villages scattered miles apart, you can understand why this blend mattered. The church gave order, calendar, and authority, but the land still held its own power. The people needed rituals that spoke to both heaven and earth. They needed nights like All Hallows Eve to remind them that the divine was not distant. It burned right there in the bonfire, flickered in the lantern, whispered in the cold wind between prayers. And yet, that closeness to the unseen made the medieval mind deeply aware of mystery. They did not separate superstition from spirituality the way we do now. A miracle and a haunting were simply different faces of the same truth. The saint who healed the sick might also appear in dreams to warn a sinner. The ghost of a restless soul might not be evil but simply asking for prayers. The line between sacred and spectral was thin, and on Halloween, it vanished entirely. Imagine, then, the evening of October 31st in the 14th century. In one corner of the village, a monk lights candles on the church altar. Their golden glow spills through stained glass, coloring the stone floor with patterns of saints. Outside, the villagers kindle torches, carrying them in slow circles around the fields to bless the soil. Children chant old rhymes that barely make sense anymore, their words a blend of Latin fragments and pagan echoes. The stars are hidden, the air smells of smoke and cider, and for one night, everything feels suspended, heaven and earth, life and death, all touching at once. This was not hypocrisy. It was continuity. The human heart resists empty spaces. When old gods fade, new saints rise to fill their absence. When old fires die, new candles are lit. The medieval blending of Samhain and Christianity was not a loss of faith but a transformation of it. It allowed people to carry the past forward, to give new names to old fears, to keep their rituals alive while believing they had changed. Even centuries later, echoes of that union remain. Every time someone lights a candle for the dead, every time bells toll on All Souls' Night, the memory of Samhain breathes beneath it. The church may have written the hymns, but the rhythm of the drums came from the old fires in the hills. Halloween survives because it holds that paradox. It honors both salvation and superstition, both memory and mystery. And perhaps that is why the night still captivates us. Beneath the costumes, candy, and glow-in-the-dark decorations, something older stirs, the ancient instinct to stand at the edge of darkness, to greet what we cannot see, to call the past by name and welcome it home. That instinct was Samhain's gift to the world, and Christianity, rather than erasing it, gave it a new language. Together they shaped a night unlike any other, a night that refuses to belong to either the living or the dead, but instead to the fragile, flickering space in between. The heart of medieval Halloween truly pulsed in the fire. Not a single blaze, but hundreds across hills, valleys, and open fields, each one breathing warmth into a world that feared the dark. Fire was more than illumination, it was protection, purification, and communication. In an age when the night seemed alive with danger and imagination alike, the bonfire became a singular act of defiance. It called the community together, fed the spirit of the village, and sent smoke spiraling into a sky crowded with unseen souls. As October's last light waned, villagers gathered what they called the winter wood. The work was communal. Children dragged sticks twice their size, men hoisted logs, women carried bundles of straw and dry thatch. By twilight, a mound of wood rose in each village green or hilltop, like a living altar. Building the fire was as meaningful as its burning work, prayer, and promise entwined. When the spark finally caught, cheers erupted. Flames licked the sky, climbing higher than rooftops, signaling that Samhain or, later, All Hallows Eve had begun. Faces glowed half-lit, half-shadowed, equalized by the firelight, peasants, clergy, and travelers alike. The fire's symbolism was ancient. For pagans, it connected earthly and divine realms. It purified the living, offered warmth to wandering souls, and repelled evil. Early Christians adapted this easily. Fire became the light of God, banishing darkness. Regardless of belief, fire stood for renewal. Some villages had twin fires. People passed between them for blessing. Others tossed bones of slaughtered livestock into the flames, symbolically completing the harvest. The crackle of burning bones gave these fires their Old English name, bone fire, which later became bonfire. Smaller rituals played out around the edges. Women murmured charms for fertility. Farmers tossed the first handful of winter grain into the blaze. Travelers traced the sign of the cross before stepping through the smoke. No single ceremony existed. Each village followed its inherited gestures. The church might not have sanctioned all of it, but tolerated what it could not erase. The people needed their fire, and no sermon could burn brighter than that. When the bonfire reached its peak, games began. Courage was tested as young men leapt through the outer flames. Couples jumped together, hoping to bind their fates. Children tossed nutshells into the fire. If a shell burned bright, health was promised. If it sputtered, misfortune loomed. Superstition was intertwined with hope. The flames acted as a living oracle, inscribing wishes into the night. When the fire settled into embers, quiet descended. People offered tokens, herbs, bread, locks of hair thrown into the embers in silence. Each gesture was both offering and farewell, soothing spirits and ensuring future prosperity. The bonfire's ashes held lasting power. Villagers collected grey ash at dawn, spreading it over fields or thresholds for protection and purification. Even the church, wary of pagan remnants, blessed ashes in Lent centuries later. The medieval Halloween fire never truly died, it simply found new altars. Standing shoulder to shoulder, smoke in your eyes, heart beating to the crackle, you could feel the fire's witness. People whispered confessions, tossed tokens, or simply gazed as the darkness beyond dissolved into the circle of warmth. In a life ruled by weather and fate, the fire was the only place humanity seemed to triumph, if only for hours. Across Scotland, bonfires crowned hilltops to be seen for miles. In Wales, villagers processed around torches, marking boundaries against wandering spirits. Ireland had fire dances, masked processions, and chants meant to awaken ancestors. These customs spread across Europe, morphing into harvest feasts, saint vigils, and carnival parades. Fire became the universal language of light against darkness. There is something deeply human in this impulse, responding to fear with brightness. The people standing around those fires were not merely waiting, they were conversing with the night. Shouting, singing, praying into the void made the void smaller. Burning became both destruction and creation, consuming old pain, debts, and illness, and kindling hope for the year to come. The beauty of the flames lay in their impermanence. Dawn left only ash, yet something unseen had shifted. From hilltops, scattered pinpoints of light marked lives defying endless darkness. Smoke carried the scent of peat, grain, and burning wood. Dogs barked, laughter floated on the wind. Even without science, people had rhythm. That rhythm kept fear at bay. Fire gave memory. Every year's flame connected to the last, linking generations. Children learned songs by heart, preserving culture. Even as Christianity reshaped symbols, the emotion persisted. Lighting the fire was lighting the bond between past and present. Long after the night ended, the glow and the echo remained. Medieval Europe was harsh plague, hunger, toil, but the bonfire told a different story. It showed that even in adversity, people made meaning. They gathered, sang, and carved a bright place amid darkness. That resilience is the true soul of medieval Halloween's fire. Modern candlelit pumpkins and bonfires echo the same instinct: we are here. We see the night coming, and we meet it together. The medieval bonfire was not merely a celebration, it was a declaration. It turned fear into spectacle, loneliness into laughter, darkness into beauty. As flames faded and smoke curled into dawn, villagers returned home, tired but content. Ashes cooled, holding their hopes, losses, and memories. And when spring returned, they spread the ashes over the fields. Life would grow from the fire's remains. That was the quiet magic of medieval Halloween, renewal born from destruction, and the promise that, even in darkness, the fire waits to be lit again. The medieval Halloween mask was more than a costume, it was survival, transformation, and a kind of magic. As the firelight faded, figures emerged from smoke and shadow, a man with a goat's skull strapped to his head. A woman in an old fur cloak, children darting under tattered linen. These were not actors for amusement, they were villagers donning disguises to navigate a night when the veil between worlds thinned. The mask was armor, camouflage, a prayer-given form. Celtic and early medieval beliefs held that spirits walked among the living on this night. Some were peaceful, others mischievous or worse. To walk safely, humans had to hide their identity, scent, shape, and soul. Mud, soot, animal skin, every disguise carried intent. Fur for strength, ash for concealment, feather for luck. It was not vanity. It was ritual. Once disguised, villagers took to streets and fields. Groups of children, neighbors, travelers went door to door. In Scotland, they were geysers. In England, souling bands. Some chanted prayers for souls. Others demanded cakes or ale with mock threats. Rough verses carried remnants of pagan hymns, folded into Christian refrains. Inside a cottage, a group might sing. A soul cake, a soul cake. Pray you good mistress, a soul cake. 1 for Peter, 2 for Paul. 3 for him who saved us all. The household gave spiced cakes marked with crosses. The visitors vanished, lanterns bobbing, faces grinning behind masks. The mask carried deeper power. For one night, peasants could mock priests, widows could laugh in death's face, children could claim respect. Disguise leveled society, offered voice and courage. It was both rebellion and release. Yet it remained sacred, masking acknowledged mystery and the unseen. The church sometimes condemned these disguises, fearing demonic invitations. Other times, priests tolerated them as mummers' plays or morality tales. Saints and sinners were acted out. Christian lessons danced with echoes of pagan ritual. Some costumes were absurd stags, bears, birds, wise women, witches blending reverence and ridicule. The ambiguity was intentional. The line between prayer, prank, warning, or joke was thin. This tradition spread across Europe, Perchtenlauf in Germany, beet and turnip lanterns in France, mumming in Ireland. Different lands, same ritual core, disguise. Door, gift, laughter. Beneath the noise lay a deeper lesson: identity is fluid. For one night, anyone could be more than themselves. In a rigid medieval society, masks offered freedom, theater, and agency. As the night wore on, disguises grew wilder. Dancers circled bonfires. Shadows leapt like second bodies. Firelight made each movement dreamlike. Pipes and drums carried sparks into the cold air, blurring the line between living and dead. Children watched. Some joined, holding flickering turnip lanterns, the original jack-o'-lanterns, grim guardians against wandering spirits. As midnight passed, laughter softened. Masks grew heavy with breath and smoke. The playful ritual thinned into solemn awareness, perhaps spirits had joined the dance. The villagers grew quiet, praying, crossing themselves, watching embers fade. By dawn, masks came off. Faces smeared with soot returned to ordinary life. Yet the memory lingered. For one night, they had stepped beyond ordinary limits. They had been visible and unseen, alive and spectral, human and other. Centuries later, the impulse survives in modern Halloween. We still cover our faces, walk in borrowed skins, dance between reality and imagination. Materials have changed: plastic, glitter, synthetic fabric, but the feeling remains: transformation, release, courage, and the thrill of stepping into another self. The mask whispers the old magic. Fear can be faced, the unknown navigated, identity explored. Medieval villagers understood instinctively: to dress as a spirit was to become one, if only until dawn, when masks slipped and the world turned ordinary again. As the church folded Samhain's wild bonfires into the calendar of saints, another custom took shape among the villages and narrow streets of medieval Europe, a quieter ritual, yet just as haunting. It was called souling. The name sounds humble, almost gentle, but its roots reached deep into both faith and hunger. On All Hallows Eve, and through the days that followed, people, mostly the poor, the young, and the wandering, went door to door offering prayers for the dead. In return, they were given small round cakes, warm from the hearth and spiced with nutmeg, cinnamon, or honey. They were called soul cakes. At first glance, it might sound like charity disguised as custom. But to those who took part, souling was sacred exchange. The cakes were not just food, they were spiritual currency, meant to ease souls from purgatory into peace. Each bite, each prayer, was believed to shorten a loved one's suffering in the afterlife. The practice grew out of the Church's teaching on All Souls' Day, yet its rhythm still pulsed with the heartbeat of older, pre-Christian traditions. It was the village's way of feeding both the living and the dead. Picture a narrow lane on a cold October night. Smoke curls from thatched roofs, carrying the scent of peat and bread. Somewhere a bell tolls, muffled by fog. From the darkness come voices high, uneven, young. A group of children in patched tunics approach a cottage, their faces blackened with soot, their hands clutching small wooden lanterns. They knock once, twice. The door creaks open, spilling firelight into the mist. The eldest child recites the old rhyme. A soul. A soul, a soul cake please. For a house of God and charity's sake. 1 for Peter, 2 for Paul. 3 for him who saved us all. The woman at the door nods, places 3 small cakes into a cloth bag, and crosses herself. For my husband, she whispers. Say a prayer for him. The children bow, murmur a few words of blessing, and move on. Behind them, the darkness swallows their footsteps. The exchange has lasted less than a minute. But it carries the weight of eternity, a transaction between worlds. Souling blurred the boundaries between almsgiving and remembrance, between ritual and survival. In an age when poverty was widespread, every crumb mattered. For children, orphans, and beggars, souling was both devotion and dinner. Some went out of genuine piety, others for the promise of a meal, but in truth, the two motives were inseparable. Faith, hunger, and hope walked side by side. In some places, it was not just children who went souling. Bands of young men and women, sometimes wearing masks or carrying musical instruments, traveled from village to village, singing hymns and offering blessings for each home they visited. Their melodies echoed through the night, mingling with the smell of damp leaves and burning wood. It must have been eerie, beautiful, and a little unsettling, the living wandering through the dark, calling out to the dead in song. The songs themselves varied by region, passed down by memory rather than ink. In England, some verses sounded cheerful, even teasing. In Ireland, they carried the mournful tone of keening, the traditional lament for the dead. In Wales, the songs sometimes blended into storytelling tales of saints, ghosts, or miracles. But beneath every version was the same heartbeat, remembrance, generosity, and the belief that kindness could bridge the gap between the living and the departed. The cakes were simple but symbolic. Round like the sun, marked with a cross, they represented the eternal cycle of life, death, and resurrection. Baked with raisins or spices, they carried warmth into the cold season. Some historians suggest they were descendants of the ancient breads offered to gods or ancestors during harvest feasts. Others see them as the Church's clever adaptation, a holy version of older, more pagan offerings. Either way, the meaning endured: feed the body, feed the soul. Sometimes the custom expanded beyond food. In a few regions, householders gave apples, nuts, or coins. Those with nothing to spare might simply offer a blessing at the door. What mattered most was participation, the shared acknowledgement that the world of the dead still touched the living. Souling made that connection tangible, edible, and audible. Every door opened was a small act of faith that community could outlast mortality. Alongside souling, another tradition evolved: guising. If souling was prayer, guising was play. It took the same door-to-door rhythm but replaced solemn prayers with tricks, songs, and jokes. The geysers disguised themselves, hence the name, with soot, rags, or crude masks, pretending to be spirits, devils, or wandering saints. They might sing or perform a short skit, then demand a treat in return. The unspoken rule was simple: those who gave would be blessed. Those who refused risked mischief. The two customs often overlapped, feeding each other's energy. Some geysers genuinely prayed for the dead between pranks. Some solars slipped jokes into their songs. In villages where everyone knew everyone else, the line between reverence and mischief blurred easily. What began as ritual remembrance became a night of community theater, half sermon, half carnival. Medieval chroniclers, especially churchmen, recorded these customs with mixed feelings. Some praised them as pious acts of charity. Others condemned them as pagan survivals dressed in Christian clothing. A few complained about drunkenness or disorder, villagers turning sacred observance into noisy festivity. But most priests tolerated souling. It fit too neatly into their teachings about almsgiving and purgatory to ban outright. Besides, it gave the poor a way to eat without begging. The practice spread widely across Britain and parts of continental Europe. In the English Midlands and northern counties, souling was particularly strong, surviving well into the 17th century. Each region developed its own rhythm. In Cheshire, children carried lanterns carved from turnips. In Yorkshire, solars wore white shrouds to mimic spirits. In Lancashire, groups of young men roamed the streets singing and collecting ale as well as cakes, a foreshadowing of the trick or treat spirit centuries later. There is a small irony in how history remembers this. Modern Halloween, with its candy and costumes, often feels like a parody of old religion. But the original trick or treat was not born in mockery, it came from prayer. The treat was a cake offered for a soul's salvation, the trick a reminder that the world beyond still had business with the living. In that sense, every modern doorstep exchange, every smiling child holding out a bag carries a faint echo of those medieval footsteps on the road, those whispered prayers for the forgotten dead. Souling and guising also reveal something profound about how people faced mortality. Death was everywhere in the Middle Ages: plague, famine, war, childbirth gone wrong. You could not hide from it. But through ritual, they turned fear into action. They baked, sang, and walked through the dark together. They gave what they had and asked for what they needed. And in that exchange, they found a kind of courage. The living fed the dead. The dead, in turn, blessed the living with safety for another year. Even the children understood this balance. For them, souling was a game, yes, but it was also education. They learned the names of the departed, the verses of the prayers, the faces of their neighbors. They saw how communities survived through giving. In their small hands, the soul cake was both treat and talisman, a promise that kindness mattered, even in a world ruled by cold and shadow. By dawn, the lanes would be quiet again. The solars and geysers returned home, tired and full, their voices hoarse from singing. In some homes, a candle still burned in the window, a light for the souls still wandering. The fire's embers glowed faintly, a last reminder that life persisted. Somewhere in the smoky distance, a church bell rang for morning mass. Another night between worlds had passed safely. Centuries later, when the Reformation swept across Europe and Protestantism challenged the doctrine of purgatory, souling began to fade. The idea of praying for the dead lost its theological foundation, but the habit of knocking, singing, and sharing treats remained. The old bones of the ritual survived. The soul simply took on new clothes. In time, Irish and Scottish immigrants carried guising to the New World, where it mingled with other harvest customs and became the Halloween we recognize today. But if you peel back the layers beneath the candy wrappers and plastic masks, you can still taste the original flavor. It is there in the act of opening your door to strangers, in the exchange of something small but meaningful, in the acknowledgement that the night holds both joy and sorrow. Souling was not just about feeding bodies or saving souls. It was about remembering that the line between giving and receiving, between life and death, is thinner than we like to believe. The medieval world, harsh as it was, understood something we often forget, that survival is communal, and remembrance is an act of love. Each soul cake passed from hand to hand was a message: you are not forgotten. That message, carried through centuries of ritual and reinvention, still whispers through our modern celebrations. We may no longer believe our prayers can lift souls from purgatory, but when we share warmth, laughter, and light on Halloween night, we are still performing the same miracle our ancestors did. We are making the darkness gentler, one door at a time. If the bonfires were the heart of Halloween in medieval Europe, then food was its breath, the living rhythm that sustained warmth, memory, and meaning. This was not the sugar-stained Halloween we know today, but a night steeped in the flavors of the earth, the remnants of harvest, and the quiet prayers of those who depended on every grain they stored. The feast was both celebration and necessity, a ritual acknowledgement that life would soon grow lean. What people ate, how they shared it, and why they offered parts of it to invisible guests spoke volumes about the fragile hope that threaded through the dark season. The medieval year revolved around the harvest. By the end of October, the fields were bare, the haylofts full, and the livestock counted. Food was survival, but it was also storytelling. Each ingredient marked a season's success or failure. A warm loaf of bread meant that the wheat crop had been kind. A full jar of honey meant bees had survived summer storms. When families gathered for All Hallows Eve, they did not dine for indulgence, they dined to mark endurance. The table was both altar and mirror, reflecting what the earth had given and what it had withheld. In small cottages lit by tallow candles, the evening meal might look humble: thick slices of coarse brown bread, roasted turnips, and bowls of pottage, a slow-cooked stew of whatever remained from the fields. On the richer tables of manors or monasteries, the menu grew more elaborate: baked apples stuffed with currants, oatcakes glazed with honey, roasted fowl, and spiced wine. But regardless of wealth, everyone shared the same impulse to gather, to give thanks, and to eat in the company of both the living and the unseen. The line between feast and offering was thin. Before eating, families placed a small portion of their meal near the hearth or on a windowsill, an invitation to wandering spirits or ancestors believed to roam that night. In Ireland and parts of Scotland, this gesture was known as feeding the dead. Some left out milk and bread. Others poured a few drops of ale onto the ground. It was both superstition and love, a way of saying, "We remember you, stay at peace." Even those who doubted such beliefs rarely dared to skip the offering. To ignore the dead was to risk their displeasure, and the long winter was too dangerous to invite ill will from any realm. In wealthier towns, communal feasts sometimes replaced private ones. After church services for All Hallows, villagers would gather in the square or a local hall for a shared meal. Long tables were laid with bread, cheese, root vegetables, and the remnants of autumn fruit. The ale flowed freely, and so did stories, tales of saints, miracles, and the odd ghost sighting. These feasts blurred the border between the sacred and the social. You could pray for the souls of the departed while laughing over spilled cider, and no one thought it strange. The dead were not distant. They were companions, invisible guests at the table. At the center of many feasts stood the soul cake, a small, round pastry that combined the sweetness of celebration with the solemnity of remembrance. Its recipe varied from place to place, but it was often made with butter, spices, and dried fruit, each cake marked with a cross to bless the soul it honored. The act of baking itself became a ritual. Women kneaded prayers into the dough, naming loved ones who had passed. Children waited by the hearth, eager for the smell that meant both food and faith. When the cakes were done, some were eaten at home, some given to visiting solars, and a few saved as offerings for the dead. In each bite was a mixture of comfort and hope, a reminder that love, like bread, could be shared infinitely. Beyond cakes and bread, other foods carried symbolic weight. Apples, for example, were central to Halloween's older rites. They were the fruit of immortality in Celtic lore and, later, tokens of temptation and wisdom in Christian stories. Games like bobbing for apples, though now playful, began as rituals of divination. A young woman might peel an apple in one long strip and toss it over her shoulder. The shape it made on the floor was said to reveal the initial of her future husband's name. Another custom involved placing apple seeds in the fire. If two burned quietly together, love would last. If they spat apart, so would the pair. These small acts of fortune-telling gave laughter to the evening but also reflected an ancient truth, that people hungered not just for food, but for meaning. Nuts, too, were part of the feast and the forecast. The harvest of hazelnuts and chestnuts symbolized wisdom, patience, and hidden strength. In some English villages, the night was even called Nutcrack Night. Families gathered by the fire, cracking nuts while telling stories about love, loss, and ghosts. Sparks from the hearth were watched for signs, each pop a message from the spirit world, or so they believed. Between laughter and silence, between superstition and comfort, these small rituals made the long night bearable. Drink held its own place of honor. Ale and mead, the latter made from honey and water, were poured liberally, shared between neighbors and strangers alike. To drink together was an act of trust, binding the community in both joy and vigilance. In some places, people dipped bread into the ale and left the soggy crusts at crossroads for the spirits who had no home. The first sip was for the living. The last, always, for the dead. Feasting was not only about food, it was about sound. The crackle of fire, the hum of conversation, the creak of wood under shifting bodies, the distant toll of the church bell all merged into a symphony of survival. Outside, the wind howled through trees, rattling shutters. Inside, the warmth of shared breath and full stomachs created an island of light. Every bite, every story, was a small defiance against the cold creeping in from beyond the walls. In monasteries and great halls, the tone was more restrained but equally meaningful. Monks chanted psalms over their meals, giving thanks for the harvest and praying for the souls of patrons and benefactors. Nobles held formal suppers where musicians played soft airs between courses. Even here, though, the shadow of Samhain lingered. Candles burned in windows to guide souls. Extra seats were set at long tables for unseen guests. The division between faith and folklore, between religion and ritual, was a line no one cared to draw too sharply. Feasting also carried a moral dimension. To share food was to practice charity, one of the church's central virtues. The poor, who might otherwise go hungry through winter, were often invited to join in or given leftovers. In many parishes, it became custom to bake extra loaves to distribute among those in need, the act sanctified as almsgiving for the souls of the departed. Thus, eating became an act of mercy, not just appetite. The very rhythm of the feast reminded everyone that fortune was fleeting, that a full table one year might be empty the next. And yet, beneath the solemnity, joy thrived. People danced after the meal, stomping their feet to keep warm, clapping to the rhythm of fiddles and pipes. The children chased each other between benches, their laughter bright against the dark. Couples slipped away into the fields, whispering secrets while the moon hid behind clouds. For all its spiritual weight, Halloween's feast was not morbid. It was alive, a celebration of endurance, of warmth wrestled from the jaws of winter. By the end of the night, bellies were full, the ale gone, and the fires burning low. The last crumbs of bread were thrown into the flames with murmured prayers. The villagers stepped outside, the cold biting their faces, but they felt lighter. The feast had done its work. The living had eaten in honor of the dead had been remembered, and for a brief time, hunger both physical and spiritual had been satisfied. The next morning, ashes from the hearth were swept up carefully. Some were scattered in the fields as blessing. Others rubbed onto doorframes for luck. The cycle continued. Each year, the feast repeated, evolving, blending with new customs and beliefs. And though the details changed, the ingredients, the prayers, the names, the core remained: food as memory, food as faith, food as fire against the cold. Even now, when Halloween means candy wrappers and processed sweetness, traces of that older feast remain. The pumpkin pie, the roasted nuts, the warm cider, they all carry echoes of the harvest table. The act of sharing food, of gathering together before winter sets in, still holds the same meaning it did centuries ago. It is not just about indulgence. It is about gratitude, about remembering that we eat because the earth allows it, and because those who came before us learned how to keep the fire alive. Medieval Halloween's feast was never about abundance. It was about connection. Each loaf, each apple, each sip of ale bound the living to the land, to their ancestors, and to one another. In a world where tomorrow was never guaranteed, that connection was everything. And so they ate not to forget death, but to honor it. Every meal was a reminder that while life is fleeting, the act of sharing it can outlast the season, the storm, and even the grave. The medieval world was alive with unseen company. To a villager standing in the quiet after the feast, staring into the cooling ashes of the bonfire, silence was never truly empty. The rustle of wind through bare trees, the flicker of candlelight against the windowpane, each carried weight. People believed the world they could see and touch was only half the story. The other half moved beside them, spirits, saints, demons, and ancestors crossing unseen thresholds. On All Hallows Eve, the thin night between seasons, that hidden half seemed to breathe closer. Superstition was not ignorance to them. It was survival. The boundaries between faith and fear were porous, and for most, impossible to separate. The same hand that crossed itself before supper might also hang an iron nail above the door or tie a sprig of rosemary over the cradle. Protection came from everywhere, church prayers and folk charms alike. When the church declared October 31st the Vigil of All Saints, it was naming what the people already felt, that this night belonged to those who had died, and to the mysteries that surrounded them. As daylight faded, the village grew quiet. Animals were brought inside, doors bolted, and shutters latched. A single candle burned in most windows, meant to guide good spirits home and warn the rest to stay away. Families sat close to the hearth, listening to stories half history, half warning about those who ignored the rules of this night. You might hear of the man who walked through a graveyard without bowing his head and was found speechless the next morning, or the woman who refused to leave bread for the dead and woke to find her grain stores empty. The lesson was simple: the unseen world had manners, and the living were expected to respect them. The belief in wandering souls was old. According to the Church, souls in purgatory could be released through prayer. According to older lore, the spirits of the restless dead, those who died violently, or without proper burial, could not rest until their stories were heard. On Halloween night, those stories might whisper through cracks in the walls, drift on the wind, or appear in the corner of your eye. Most spirits were thought harmless if treated kindly. Still, people spoke softly after dark, careful not to draw attention. If you heard your name called from outside, you did not answer. It might not be a living voice. Beyond human souls, there were other presences. In Celtic lands, the Ows see the people of the mounds were said to walk freely during Samhain. These beings were not quite gods and not quite ghosts, but something older, nature's shadow, beautiful and dangerous. They could bless a household or blight it, bring fortune or fever. Their hills were avoided at night, and travelers left offerings milk, butter, or bits of bread on stones and crossroads to keep them appeased. The Church tried to fold these beings into its theology, calling them fallen angels or wayward spirits, but the old names endured in whispers. The natural world was full of omens. A dog howling before midnight was a sign that spirits were near. An owl at the window meant a soul had passed. Candles that burned blue were said to mark a ghost's presence. Those that sputtered were warning of bad luck. The turning of the year sharpened these signs. Nature itself seemed to play tricks, mist rising from the ground like breath, strange lights in the marshes, echoes that carried too far. For villagers who lived so close to death, plague, childbirth, and hunger always hovering, these omens were reminders of how thin their own thread was. Every household had its own methods for keeping danger away. Salt scattered on the doorstep. Bread crumbs placed on windowsills. Iron scissors hung open above the cradle to ward off changelings. Garlic, though less common in Northern Europe, sometimes appeared in doorways or kitchens for similar reasons. A horseshoe nailed to the threshold could trap bad luck before it crossed inside. If someone had to travel after dark, they carried a piece of coal or a burning twig from the communal fire light borrowed from protection itself. Dreams, too, were a realm of contact. It was said that on All Hallows Eve, the dead could speak through dreams more clearly than at any other time. Some people lay out the clothes of lost loved ones or placed their shoes by the fire, hoping for a visitation. The boundary between comfort and terror was thin here as well. A gentle dream of a parent or child might bring peace. A nightmare of the unknown could linger for years. Either way, it meant the veil had opened, and something or someone had reached through. Superstition filled even the simplest acts. When blowing out the candle before bed, one had to whisper a blessing, or the darkness might take the flame's spirit. The last ember of the fire was left glowing overnight, believed to guide any wandering soul who entered the house. If a sudden chill passed through the room, people would murmur a prayer. God rest their soul. Death was constant enough that even superstition carried tenderness. Fear and empathy were tangled threads. In the fields beyond the village, ghost lights, what we now call the wisps, were said to be spirits of lost travelers or thieves condemned to wander forever. Farmers claimed to see them bobbing near marshes or burial mounds. To follow one was perilous. It could lead you into the bog. But if you bowed your head and greeted it politely, the light might bless your fields with fertility. Medieval people did not see such phenomena as tricks of physics. They were moral stories written in flame, reflections of their own conscience dancing in the dark. Not all beliefs were somber. There was mischief in the night, too. Some villagers disguised themselves as spirits, carrying the tradition of guising to frighten friends or neighbors, knocking on doors in silence or leaving bundles of straw that looked like sleeping bodies. The laughter that followed was its own form of warding. Humor, like fire, burned fear away. By mocking spirits, the living reminded themselves they were still among the breathing. At the edge of every village stood a churchyard, the meeting place of superstition and salvation. On Halloween night, candles flickered between gravestones, their tiny flames multiplied by mist. Families came to pray for the dead, but few lingered after midnight. The air felt charged there, as if the earth itself exhaled memory. In some regions, People claimed to see ghostly processions, long lines of spirits moving toward the church doors. The church neither confirmed nor denied such visions. It simply urged the faithful to pray harder. The idea of a wild hunt also haunted medieval Europe. In this legend, a spectral host of riders swept through the skies on stormy nights, led by a ghostly king or ancient god. To hear their horns was bad luck. To see them was worse. Some believed the hunt passed every All Hallows Eve, gathering souls of the unbaptized or those who died unshriven. To protect oneself, a person might throw themselves face down, muttering prayers, or turn their clothes inside out, a small act of defiance against cosmic order. What is remarkable is how these beliefs coexisted peacefully with Christian faith. A villager could attend Mass in the morning, then hang herbs in the doorway that night. To modern minds, this seems contradictory. To medieval ones, it was balance. Religion provided structure. Superstition provided immediacy. Together, they made sense of a world where death was near and mystery constant. The unseen was not denied. It was negotiated with. And so, Halloween night became a kind of dialogue between realms. The living spoke to the dead through prayer, food, and gesture. The dead answered through dreams, omens, or silence. The fire stood between them, burning, protecting, illuminating. Every superstition, however strange, was an attempt to hold that fragile conversation steady. As dawn approached, candles guttered low, and roosters began to crow. The first light of November spilled over frost-covered fields. Families opened their doors, breathing the cold morning air. If nothing strange had happened, they whispered thanks. If something had a creak, a voice, a chill, they whispered thanks too. Either way, the night had passed, the balance restored. Centuries later, much of this superstition would fade under the weight of science and skepticism. Yet traces of it remain, tucked inside our language and rituals. We still carve lanterns to scare away shadows, still tell ghost stories by firelight, still glance over our shoulders when the night feels too quiet. The medieval villagers may have seen spirits where we see wind, but their instincts were not so different from ours. Both seek meaning in mystery. Both believe, in their own ways, that the world is alive. And perhaps they were right to believe so. Even now, when you blow out a candle on Halloween night and watch the smoke curl upward, there is a brief, silent moment before it disappears, a breath between light and dark. The villagers would have called it a soul passing by. We might call it imagination. But for that heartbeat of time, we are connected to them, sharing the same small wonder, that maybe, just maybe, something unseen still lingers in the night. Once the fires had burned down and the prayers were said, Halloween in the medieval world often slipped from sacred ritual into something unruly. What began as reverence for the dead and protection against spirits could easily tip into chaos, a night where rules loosened, roles reversed, and mischief thrived. Beneath the smoke and incense, human nature stirred, curiosity, defiance, and the hunger for laughter in a life otherwise ruled by order. Halloween was both devotion and release, and that tension between fear and freedom was what made it endure. The medieval church, for all its authority, understood the power of the crowd. The people needed their feast days. After harvest, before winter's long silence, there had to be a night when everyone could breathe, laugh, and shake off the year's weight. But even holy calendars could not contain the wildness that lived in people. And on All Hallows Eve, that wildness had permission to come out just a little. As night deepened, the line between piety and parody blurred. After attending Mass, some villagers left candles at the graves of loved ones, and then headed straight for the alehouse. Once the cups began to empty and the laughter rose, restraint thinned. Those in masks and rags from the earlier guising often roamed the streets again, emboldened now by drink and anonymity. They were not just pretending to be spirits, they were playing with power. In small villages, mischief often began harmlessly. Young men knocked on doors and ran. Someone tied a neighbor's gate shut or swapped a signpost. A bucket of water might be balanced above a doorway. A sheep led quietly into the churchyard, or the blacksmith's tools hidden in the priest's cart. The laughter that followed was more than mere fun, it was a shared secret, a brief rebellion against hierarchy. On most days, life was predictable and punishing. On this one night, the powerless could play at control. Records from medieval England and France describe how lords and priests frequently complained about such antics. Yet even as they issued warnings or fines, most tolerated the pranks. They knew this kind of misrule was a pressure valve. People needed release before winter's discipline set in. The same instinct that fueled mischief also fueled survival. It kept despair from taking root. Still, some nights went too far. Ale mixed with anonymity could sour easily into vandalism or violence. Parish records mention smashed lanterns, broken fences, and even small fires set in jest. One chronicle from 14th century York describes masked rogues who overturned wagons and frightened horses, claiming to drive out spirits. The line between ritual cleansing and riot was dangerously thin. For this reason, town councils occasionally issued edicts before All Hallows, banning masks after curfew or forbidding bonfires within city walls. The rules rarely stopped anyone, but they revealed a nervous truth: authority feared what the dark might encourage. In the countryside, the power of mischief was more symbolic. Many of the acts carried echoes of older fertility rituals or harvest games, farmers moving tools, young couples stealing apples from neighboring orchards, children knocking on doors and chanting nonsense songs. To those who joined in, it was not rebellion so much as participation in the old rhythm of the year. Order and disorder took turns. Both were necessary. Women, often confined by daily life, found their own small freedoms in the night's confusion. Some disguised themselves and joined the guisers. Others performed fortune-telling rites in secret. A popular one involved standing before a mirror at midnight with a candle, hoping to glimpse a future lover or, if unlucky, a skull. The act was equal parts thrill and defiance. In a world where fate was usually decided by fathers, priests, and poverty, claiming even a glimpse of one's own destiny felt intoxicating. For children, mischief was simply joy. They followed older youths through the village, echoing songs, stealing apples, or tapping on windows. In the morning, they would boast about how late they would stayed out, how close they would come to a ghost. Parents might scold them, but softly. It was better, after all, that the young learned to flirt with fear and laughter than face it unprepared. At the same time, Halloween's misrule tested the boundaries of religious control. Church leaders walked a fine line, condemning excess while exploiting the festival's energy. Some parishes hosted mock plays where villagers, under supervision, acted out morality tales, death confronting a proud merchant, or a trickster outwitted by a saint. These plays used humor to reinforce virtue, blending entertainment and sermon. The people got their laughter. The clergy kept their authority. But outside church walls, laughter could turn subversive. The festival became a mirror for social tension. Peasants mocked landlords by dressing as nobles or priests. Servants borrowed their masters' clothes, parading through town in imitation of power. The absurdity delighted the crowd precisely because everyone knew it was temporary. Come morning, the old order would return. But for one night, the illusion tasted like justice. The church called such antics misrule, but tolerated them because they echoed deeper cycles. Medieval life was filled with inversion festivals, days when servants played masters, when fools were crowned kings. These rituals did not threaten order. They reinforced it by letting people feel the edge of rebellion without crossing it. Halloween simply added ghosts and shadows to the mix. The night was not lawless, it was licensed chaos. Sanctioned catharsis. Yet underneath the jokes lay anxiety. Every prank carried a trace of the supernatural, a superstition that to mock death was to invite it. Some pranks were designed not just for humor but as protection, scaring spirits away by imitating them, making noise to drive off evil. The banging of pots, the laughter, the chaos, all part of an ancient logic: if the dead roam the night, best to convince them we are just as wild. The line between jest and warning blurred completely. As midnight neared, mischief often turned ritual again. The same young men who'd stolen gates or moved carts might return to the bonfire's ashes, laughing but reverent, tossing in the last scraps of wood. A hush would fall, a few final prayers muttered. They knew, in their bones, that laughter was only safe when followed by respect. Defying authority was a game. Defying the unseen world was not. By dawn, calm returned. Broken fences were fixed, missing sheep retrieved, gates rehung. Life resumed its quiet rhythm. No one spoke much about the night's disorder. It was understood. The mischief was part of the year's balance, a shadow of the same pattern that shaped harvest and hunger, feast and fasting. Even punishment, when it came, was mild, an acknowledgement that those who played too hard had simply been caught in the spell of the night. Still, authorities never stopped trying to tame it. As cities grew and parishes gained stricter control, bans on masks and late-night revelry appeared across Europe. By the 16th century, reformers viewed such customs as dangerous remnants of paganism. They preferred silence and order to laughter and ash. Yet even as rules multiplied, the instinct persisted. Mischief moved indoors, hidden songs, traveled with immigrants across oceans. In quieter forms, it became the playful side of Halloween we still know today, the trick in Trick or Treat, a faint echo of those villagers testing the limits of their world. Looking back, it is easy to see why the medieval Halloween needed its mischief. Life was hard and short. Obedience was constant. The church ruled the soul, the landlord ruled the land, and the seasons ruled everything else. A night that allowed disorder was not sin, it was balance. It let people taste freedom without breaking faith, mock power without collapsing it, and laugh at death without denying its weight. In that laughter lay something holy. It was a reminder that even in a world shadowed by plague, penance, and fear, joy could still flare up loud, foolish, human. The villagers who tipped over wagons and sang rude songs beneath the church tower were not just rebels. They were keeping alive the oldest truth of all ritual: that life, to endure, must make space for release. Without mischief, reverence turns brittle. Without laughter, faith loses warmth. So they played. They shouted into the dark, rattled their chains, turned their world upside down for a few wild hours. And when dawn came, they went back to work, soot on their faces, smoke in their hair, the memory of freedom still glowing faintly inside. In their defiance, they had renewed their faith not in authority, but in life itself. When dawn finally broke after the long night of fire, laughter, and superstition, the world seemed to exhale. The air smelled faintly of smoke and damp soil. Bonfires had burned low, leaving gray skeletons of ash across the fields. In that pale light, the mood of the village shifted. The noise was gone. The masks were gone. It was November 1st, All Saints' Day, and the sacred calm of morning replaced the wildness of the night before. For medieval people, This day was not a separate event from Halloween but its completion, the other side of the coin. Where the night was for the restless dead and the trickster living, the morning was for sanctity, remembrance, and order. It was the moment when everything that had unraveled under the moon was woven back together by prayer and ritual. The bell in the church tower tolled early, a slow, steady sound that carried over the frost-tipped fields. It called the villagers from their homes, their bodies tired, their voices hoarse from laughter and smoke. They came in small groups, cloaks drawn tight, carrying candles and baskets. Some still smelled faintly of ale. Some had ashes on their faces from the night's bonfires. But all understood that this morning was holy. Inside the stone church, the air was cold but thick with the scent of wax and incense. Light filtered through narrow stained glass windows, painting the floor with thin rivers of color. The priest, his voice rough from the chill, began the litany of saints name after name, saint after saint, a roll call of heaven meant to remind everyone that death was not the end, only a passage. People knelt on wooden floors and whispered along, each syllable a small act of devotion, a way to steady themselves after the unpredictable night. For the church, All Saints' Day was meant to sanctify what had come before, to gather the unruly spirits of Halloween and place them within divine order. The festival honored not just the famous saints but the forgotten ones, the countless souls who had lived holy lives unseen. It was a collective celebration of goodness. A reminder that the world's darkness was never complete. Yet even in church, traces of last night lingered. The children who had gone souling now stood with their families, clutching candles instead of cakes. The men who had danced around the bonfire now crossed themselves with quiet guilt. The women who had whispered fortunes in mirrors now prayed twice as hard. There was no shame in this contradiction. It was simply how the medieval world breathed in cycles of fear and forgiveness, chaos and calm. After Mass, villagers filed out into the pale morning. The sun was weak, a white disk behind low clouds, but it was enough. They walked to the graveyard beside the church, where frost clung to the grass and stones leaned with age. Here, the prayers continued. Families knelt by graves, brushing away leaves, lighting small candles that guttered in the wind. Some brought flowers, though few could spare them. Others brought sprigs of rosemary or ivy. They murmured names softly, as if speaking to the ground itself. This ritual, simple, solemn, communal, was one of the most human moments of the medieval year. It carried the emotional weight of survival and memory. People who had faced plague and famine, who knew how thin the thread of life could be, found comfort in believing their loved ones were not lost but merely waiting in a better place. The graveyard, for a brief moment, felt less like a place of sorrow and more like a bridge. Children helped tend the candles, their small fingers red with cold. Some asked innocent questions: can they hear us, are they cold under there, and their parents answered as gently as they could. The older folk, who had buried more than they could count, said nothing. Their silence was its own kind of faith. By midday, the solemnity softened into community. People shared bread and cider outside the church, laughing quietly now, the wildness of Halloween reduced to a memory. The priest blessed baskets of food that would be sent to the poor, what remained of the previous night's feast, transformed into alms. This act of giving, called souling charity, bridged the spiritual and the practical. Feeding the hungry became another form of prayer. The church itself used this moment to reinforce unity. All Saints' Day was a sermon in motion, proof that even the most superstitious villagers could return to grace. It reminded them that faith was not destroyed by laughter or disguise but renewed by them. After all, the people who had sung in the darkness now prayed in the light. Those who had worn masks now revealed their faces to the divine. The transition was seamless. almost poetic, a yearly rhythm of sin and sanctity that defined medieval spirituality. In monasteries and abbeys, the observance was more structured but equally heartfelt. Bells rang hourly. The monks sang long chants that seemed to stretch the day into something eternal. In some places, illuminated manuscripts were read aloud, stories of martyrs and miracles that painted holiness in vivid color. The rhythm of the voices, the echo of Latin psalms against stone walls, created a soundscape of serenity. Outside, the world might still be wild, but inside those walls, heaven felt near. For ordinary people, the saint they prayed to often depended on their needs. Farmers prayed to Saint Isidore for fertile soil. Mothers prayed to Saint Bridget for their children's health. Sailors and traders invoked Saint Nicholas to protect them on the road. The saints were not abstract icons, they were familiar figures, part of the family, mediators between earth and eternity. On this day, the villagers felt surrounded not just by ghosts, but by guardians. By evening, when the light began to fade again, the village grew quiet in a different way. There was no fear in this dusk. The fires were smaller now, set only in hearths, not in fields. Families ate together again, though more simply stew, bread, perhaps a little mead. The mood was peaceful, almost relieved. The night before had belonged to the dead, but this one belonged to the living who remembered them. The Church often called this balance Hallowtide, 3 days of connection between heaven, earth, and purgatory. All Hallows Eve for the wandering souls, All Saints' Day for the glorified, and All Souls' Day for the suffering. Together, they formed a kind of spiritual architecture, a map of the invisible world. And though the theology was complex, the emotion was simple. Love did not end with death. The villagers might not have understood the Latin of the priests, but they understood that message. In the years that followed, as these traditions spread and changed, the essence of that morning, the quiet after the storm, remained. It became the blueprint for renewal in every cycle of human life, wildness followed by reflection, darkness followed by light. Even centuries later, when Halloween turned into a night of masks and candy, something of that rhythm still lingered. The morning after is still the moment when we take a breath, remember, and return to ourselves. Standing in that medieval village, as the church bells ring one last time and the smoke from the fires curls into the cold sky, it is easy to see why All Saints' Day mattered so deeply. It was not just about saints or doctrine. It was about restoration. It was the village whispering to itself, "We have faced the dark, and we are still here." And so they were. Year after year, generation after generation, the same cycle repeated. Fire, fear, laughter, prayer. Each season turning like the wheel of a cart on the same old road. For a world that lived so close to death, All Saints' Day was proof of endurance, that holiness could rise from ashes, and that even the longest night could end in light. If All Saints' Day was a song of praise for the blessed, then the next dawn brought a quieter, heavier melody. November 2nd, All Souls' Day, belonged not to the holy or the heroic, but to the ordinary dead. To the mothers who had died in childbirth, the children who never grew, the soldiers buried far from home, the sinners who were neither damned nor saved. This day was for them, the forgotten majority who still lingered between worlds, needing prayer, needing love. The Church called it Commemoratio Omnium Fidelium Defunctorum, the remembrance of all the faithful departed. But to villagers, it was simpler, a day to talk to the dead. The theology behind it was dense, the concept of purgatory, the cleansing fire that purified souls before heaven, but people did not think in scholastic terms. They thought in gestures. Lighting candles. Saying names. Breaking bread. Each act was a small bridge thrown across the river that separated them from those they loved. The morning began with bells again. Slow and solemn, tolling through fog. The sound was deeper than the bright peal of feast days. It was weighted, deliberate. Each ring was a prayer, calling the lost toward peace. Villagers rose early, many still sore from harvest labor or from the revelry of Halloween, but this was a duty they never skipped. Death had touched every family. No one could pretend they were untouched. Inside the church, the altar was draped in black and purple. The candles burned lower, their light softer, almost mournful. The priest recited the Requiem Mass, his Latin echoing against the cold stone. Requiem aeternam dona eis, Domini grant them eternal rest, O Lord. The congregation murmured responses, the sound of their voices like wine through leaves. Some knelt with heads bowed, eyes closed tight, whispering personal names under their breath. Others simply stared at the floor, their thoughts wandering to the graves outside. Outside, the world seemed to match the mood. The last leaves fell from trees. Smoke hung low from hearths. Even animals were quiet. The air itself felt reverent, as if nature knew this day was not for laughter but for listening. In the graveyard, the frost from the previous night sparkled faintly on the headstones. Children followed their parents there after Mass, carrying candles, bread, or bunches of dried herbs. They placed them carefully at the graves, repeating words they barely understood. It did not matter, the ritual itself was enough. For many, this day was the most personal of the entire year. Saints were distant. Souls were family. And unlike the saints, these souls still needed help. That belief shaped the emotional heart of All Souls' Day. The Church taught that prayers, masses, and acts of charity could ease a soul's suffering in purgatory, shortening its stay. So people prayed not only out of memory, but out of responsibility. The living had work to do for the dead. Offerings continued beyond candles and prayers. Food played its quiet role again. Some families baked special loaves, soul bread or dead cakes, which they distributed to the poor for the love of God and the release of souls. In some regions, each cake represented one departed person, and the baker whispered the name while shaping it. Those who received them were asked to eat and say a prayer in return, linking strangers through a chain of remembrance. Every bite, every word, was believed to move a soul one step closer to heaven. The poorest among them, who could not afford to bake or give, offered labor instead. They swept the church, cleaned the graveyard, or fetched water for others. Charity, no matter its form, was currency in this economy of the afterlife. To give was to save. To remember was to redeem. The tone of the day was not entirely sorrowful, though. Beneath the mourning ran a quiet resilience, a sense of continuity. People spoke softly but smiled often. Children played among the tombs once the prayers were done, their laughter mingling with candle smoke. Death was not denied. It was integrated into life. In medieval thought, mourning and gratitude could coexist. The dead were not terrifying strangers but invisible kin, and grief was a form of love that simply changed its shape. As the day wore on, families visited multiple graves, parents, siblings, friends, sometimes walking miles between churchyards. Travelers passed each other on the muddy roads, exchanging nods, sometimes names. The same people who had danced together on Halloween now crossed paths in silence, their hands full of candles. The wheel of the season turned from noise to stillness. In monastic communities, the rituals of All Souls' Day were more formal but no less human. Monks read aloud the necrologium, a long roll of the dead names of brothers, patrons, and benefactors written over centuries. Each name was followed by the same phrase, orate pro anima aegis, pray for his soul. The repetition turned prayer into rhythm, almost music. As the chanting continued, smoke from hundreds of candles filled the air, and the monastery seemed to float inside a soft haze of memory. Lay people outside the cloister built their own forms of remembrance. Some carved small crosses into doorframes or marked stones with the initials of the deceased. Others burned juniper or herbs in their homes, believing the rising smoke would carry prayers upward. Bells were rung not just in churches but by hand in doorways and crossroads. Each sound meant to remind wandering souls they were not forgotten. The notion of purgatory, so central to this day, gave comfort despite its fear. It made death negotiable. Instead of a fixed judgment, it offered process a path that could be shortened through love and effort. The theology might have been complex, but its emotional simplicity was profound. You could still help the ones you had lost. That idea, more than any sermon, kept people lighting candles year after year. As evening came, the graveyard glowed faintly. Candles flickered between stones like a constellation fallen to earth. The villagers lingered, reluctant to leave. For many, this was the only time they spoke directly to their dead out loud, unguarded. Some whispered thanks. Others confessed regrets. The wind carried those fragments of speech across the field and into the dark. It was said that the souls heard and were comforted. By the time the final prayers were finished, night had returned. But this darkness felt different from Halloween's. It was not charged with fear or mischief. It was calm, familiar, the kind of darkness that invites rest. The living returned home, their steps slower now, their hearts lighter. They had done their part. The dead would rest easier. The living would sleep better. In many ways, All Souls' Day was the truest reflection of medieval faith, not in its hierarchy or its rituals, but in its intimacy. It turned theology into touch, the feel of wax melting onto skin, the scent of bread baking for a ghost, the warmth of shared silence. It showed that remembrance was not a backward-looking act but a living one, a renewal of connection across the veil. Over time, these customs would evolve. The Reformation would challenge the doctrine of purgatory. Many Protestant regions would abandon All Souls' Day altogether. Yet the instinct to remember persisted. Even when theology faded, the candles remained. Even when the prayers were replaced by quiet moments or photographs, the human need to reach backward to honor, to speak, to believe that love survives death endured. That endurance is perhaps the clearest legacy of All Souls' Day. It taught that memory is sacred labor. That every name spoken aloud becomes a small resurrection. And that even when we no longer believe in purgatory, we still believe in presence. When we light a candle, when we whisper to a photograph, when we keep a loved one's chair empty but waiting, we are performing the same ancient act, softened by time but unchanged in purpose. In that sense, the medieval villagers were not wrong. The dead do not vanish. They stay where they are remembered in story, in ritual, in the rhythm of ordinary days. The flames of their candles may have burned out centuries ago, but the light still moves quietly among us, flickering wherever love refuses to forget. When the last candle of All Souls' Night guttered out and the church bells fell silent, the season of ghosts and saints slipped quietly into memory. Yet something of it stayed woven into the habits, superstitions, and small joys that survived the centuries. Medieval Halloween did not end. It transformed. What began as firelight on a hill in the dark of autumn became, over time, a reflection of how humans carry their fears and faith through history. Its legacy is not simply the holiday we now know, but a way of seeing the world, as a place forever poised between mystery and meaning, between reverence and play. In its earliest form, medieval Halloween was an instinct more than a doctrine, a shared understanding that the boundary between life and death was porous. People lived close to the soil, to the weather, to illness and hunger. Every season brought reminders that survival was fragile. The rituals of Samhain, All Hallows, and All Souls were not just superstition. They were responses to that truth. Lighting fires, baking cakes, disguising oneself, saying names, these were ways to make peace with uncertainty. When the living could not control fate, they learned to participate in it. Over centuries. As Europe's faiths blended and shifted, these customs adapted rather than disappeared. The Church gave them names and structure: vigils, masses, indulgences. The peasants gave them laughter and song. The aristocracy turned them into pageantry, with parades of masked saints and martyrs. And beneath all of it, the same old pulse beat steadily, the recognition that death was not something to be denied, but to be honored, mocked, and occasionally befriended. By the late Middle Ages, the festival season of Hallowtide, 3 days spanning October 31st to November 2nd, had become one of the most emotionally complex moments of the year. It carried grief and gratitude in equal measure. It allowed people to face loss together, to confront fear through action. Even when plague swept through towns, people still lit their candles and whispered names. When famine emptied cupboards, they still left bread on the windowsill for the wandering dead. The persistence of these gestures said something quiet but profound: humanity does not stop hoping, even when hope feels absurd. As literacy spread and written records replaced oral tradition, some of the spontaneity of medieval Halloween faded. Clerics began to standardize liturgies. Local customs were labeled superstitious. Reformers in the 16th century would later condemn the very prayers and offerings that had once been comfort. But culture is stubborn. While the theology of purgatory waned, the practice of remembrance refused to die. Families still visited graves, even if they called the act by a different name. Children still played at disguises, though the reasons were forgotten. The old energy found new outlets, slipping from religion into folklore, from folklore into festival. The transformation of Halloween from sacred observance to seasonal celebration was not a loss so much as an evolution. Each age remade it in its own image. In medieval villages, it was a communion of souls. In post-Reformation England, it became a night of storytelling and mischief. In the 19th century, Irish and Scottish immigrants carried those stories to America, where the autumn harvest, the Protestant work ethic, and the growing fascination with death and the supernatural created fertile ground for a new version of the old feast. There, the customs scattered like seeds and took root in unexpected ways. The soul cakes became candy. The geysers became trick-or-treaters. The carved turnip lanterns grew into pumpkins, brighter and less fragile. The bonfires became backyard parties. Yet behind the laughter and plastic masks, the emotional architecture remained hauntingly medieval. We still gather at dusk. We still disguise ourselves. We still play with fear as if taming it through imitation. We still knock on doors asking to be acknowledged, to be given something sweet in exchange for goodwill. Every child with a flashlight and a pillowcase is reenacting the oldest compact between the living and the dead: feed me, remember me, let me pass unharmed through the dark. The modern world has made death less visible. Hospitals replaced homes as the site of dying. Cemeteries moved beyond town walls. But Halloween, in its modern form, quietly preserves the space where mortality and imagination meet. It turns dread into art: pumpkin faces, ghost stories, costumes, and transforms anxiety into joy. That function would have been instantly recognizable to a medieval villager. They, too, turned their fears into ritual. We just use different tools: LEDs instead of torches, sugar instead of bread, masks of superheroes instead of saints or spirits. It is tempting to think that modern Halloween has lost its soul to commerce, that the original meaning has been buried under candy wrappers. But that judgment misses something subtle. What people seek on Halloween today is not so different from what they sought centuries ago: contact, release, and permission. A night to laugh at death, to wear what we usually hide, to belong to something larger and older than ourselves. Beneath the surface noise, there is still the ancient pulse of Samhain. The whisper that says, "The veil is thin tonight." Even the imagery we associate with Halloween: ghosts, skeletons, witches, black cats, has deep medieval roots. Monks once painted memento mori skulls in their manuscripts to remind readers of mortality. Cats, associated with mystery and female power, were alternately revered and feared. Witches were the Christianized echoes of older wise women, herbalists who knew how to tend both body and spirit. Every modern decoration carries a faint aftertaste of that past, a reminder that we have always needed symbols to talk about what we can't face directly. In some ways, our fascination with Halloween's darkness reveals a paradox. The medieval mind feared spirits but also accepted them as part of life. We, on the other hand, often deny the reality of death and then crave its theatrical return once a year. The costumes, the haunted houses, the horror films, they are our modern version of standing at the bonfire, letting the flames throw shadows that both terrify and comfort. We stage our fear because we no longer have rituals to contain it. Halloween fills that void, half serious, half ridiculous, entirely human. And yet, something of grace remains in it. When children race through neighborhoods, when adults gather around fire pits with cider and laughter, when candles flicker inside carved pumpkins, a quiet echo of the old prayers stirs beneath the surface. It is the same wish that guided those villagers centuries ago: may the dark pass gently, may the dead rest kindly, may we all find our way home. Every Halloween, we rehearse that hope without naming it. The lights, the costumes, the stories, they are our version of medieval faith, stripped of dogma but not of depth. We no longer say Requiem Aeternam, but we still believe that remembrance matters. We no longer walk to graveyards with loaves of bread, but we post photos, light candles, tell stories. The forms have changed. The impulse has not. We still need to feel that love outlasts death, that laughter can tame fear, that the night can be faced with open eyes. When you trace Halloween backward through centuries of change, it becomes less a holiday and more a mirror. It shows each generation what it fears most and how it chooses to face it. The medieval peasant feared famine and plague, so they lit fires and prayed for protection. The modern citizen fears loneliness and meaninglessness, so they create community in the dark, dressing up together, telling stories, pretending for one night that the world is both stranger and kinder than it seems. In that way, Halloween remains a conversation with our ancestors. Every flickering candle, every costume, every shared laugh is part of that ongoing dialogue. The medieval villagers spoke to their dead in prayer. We speak to ours through ritual memory, through art, through the stories we keep alive. The method changes, but the message endures: you are not forgotten, and neither are we. As the night ends and the lights go out, the silence that follows feels familiar. The medieval world would have recognized it: the hush after the fire, the cool breath of November air, the sense that something unseen has passed through and left us slightly changed. Halloween's truest inheritance is not fear or fantasy. It is continuity. It reminds us that we come from people who built meaning out of darkness, who learned to make the unknown beautiful. Centuries have passed, and yet the pattern remains: fire, shadow, laughter, prayer. Whether whispered in Latin or shouted through plastic vampire teeth, the same wish survives: that the light we kindle tonight, however small, will be enough to carry us through the long winter ahead. As the final embers fade and the night gives way to dawn, we can pause and reflect on what medieval Halloween truly teaches us. It was not just about fear, superstition, or surviving the dark. It was about community, shared experience, and the rituals that connect us to each other and to those who came before. From the towering bonfires to the humble soul cakes, from the laughter of children darting through the shadows to the quiet prayers whispered for the departed, every act carried meaning. Modern Halloween may be brighter, sweeter, and far less smoky, but the essence remains the same, a night where imagination meets tradition, where fear is softened by companionship, and where the past and present touch, if only for a few hours. So, as you carve your pumpkins, light your candles, or share stories around the fire, remember the legacy of those medieval villagers. They remind us that even in a world of uncertainty, a little ritual, a little laughter, and a little courage can light the way. Hold on to that sense of wonder, honor the traditions that came before, and let this Halloween be not just about tricks and treats, but about connection, remembrance, and joy. Thank you for joining me tonight on this journey through time. May your nights be full of warmth, your stories full of life, and your Halloween filled with magic both old and new. Until next time, stay curious, stay brave, and enjoy every flickering moment.